three things in setup. Firstly, what do we think securitization means? I think fairly intuitively, it means things like build up of military capacity. It looks like, for example, adding additional ships to your fleet and things like that. Secondly, the topic says that this is the increasing military securitization, which I think begs the question of where the securitization is disproportionately happening. The thing that we would posit with opening government is that this is obviously somewhat a general increase in securitization, but I think disproportionately it happens to be smaller countries in the region that are increasing their military capacity at a faster rate than bigger countries for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because there's a bigger proportion of their existing capacity, like they need to catch up to other bigger powers in the region. For example, if China adds a couple of destroyers to its fleet, that doesn't really make a difference because it already has a massive fleet. But for example, if Micronesia adds a ship to its fleet, then that is a massive difference. And they a lot of these smaller countries are focused on other things before, like economic development, which are the precondition to military buildup. And so now, once they are further and further economically developing things like that, they have now the budget to spend on their military. But secondly, because a lot of these smaller countries now have the additional backing of large nations. So for example, the US is doing a lot of military investment in places like the Philippines because it's increasingly geopolitically important. Which means that it's countries in Oceania, it's smaller countries in ASEAN, whose military capacity is rising at a faster rate than is the case in countries like China. Third piece of setup, what do we mean by regional peace? We think obviously this means to some extent like military peace, so countries not going to war with each other, but it also I think means things like more diplomacy, it looks like things like more cordial relations, it looks like things like more trade and less trade conflict and things like that. I think there are a broad variety of things you can talk about under the umbrella of regional peace. If any of that's unclear, I'm happy to take a clarification. Okay. If not, I'm going to do two arguments. Firstly, why this makes conflict less likely. I have three things I want to talk about on this argument. Firstly is like a mechanism that I didn't really know how to name, so I just sort of as a useful heuristic called it mutually assured destruction. But obviously that's a bit of a scary name, so it's just a name. But a couple of reasons why countries now have less of an incentive to go to conflict with each other. Firstly, it's because it makes less and less sense to actually make a trade-off to go to conflict. They don't want to provoke other countries, because if it is the case that all countries' military capacity is rising, it means it is far, far more expensive and far, far more destructive if it is the case that conflict occurs. Which means that this is a useful deterrent, right? No country now has the incentive to go to conflict with each other. Firstly, because it would be more economically devastating, but secondly, because it increasingly tank their electoral support. Because if it is the case that now, previously, a small conflict would be fairly localized, wouldn't take that many lives, not cost you much money, that does not become a pressing voting issue for people. But if it is the case that your country has, sleepwalked into a massive conflict that costs you millions of dollars that you necessarily have to commit to for the next few years, that is something that is very, very electorally damaging, which means that politicians have a unique incentive now to be risk averse. So now, instead of actual conflict, you're comparatively far more likely just to have things like shows of power or military drills, kind of sailing ships next to each other rather than them actually engaging, or it may be the worst case scenario, small localized skirmishes, things like that. But now, countries have an incentive to, for example, set clearer lines, what is acceptable and what is not. Because if it is the case there is an accident which escalates that is far, far worse on the outside of the house, or it is the case that politicians now try and de-escalate conflict and tensions when there are accidents. Previously before, if it is the case there was an accidental, ships fired on each other, then it is less expensive and less electorally costly for you to escalate that into a conflict. But now if it's the case that you cannot commit to that, politicians now need to negotiate with each other to try and de-escalate the conflict, make it clear why it is the case that instance occurred. The second reason under mutually assured destruction is that we think that this is especially the case as countries now have an incentive to present a unified front. That is to say, with increased military securitization, it is not only that each individual country is getting more securitized, it is that they now have a trajectory to form regional alliances because it is the case that they want to be protected from regional superpowers. For example, this looks like defense treaties, like the US making military pacts with Asian nations, and things like that. Which means that as countries become increasingly, it looks like things like, for example, if one of these countries is attacked, all of them have to come to its defense and things like that, which means that countries become increasingly intertwined in terms of regional security, which means that now, if you go to war with another country, you're not just going to war with that another country, you're going to war with 6 other Asian nations plus the US, which means you have far, far less incentive to do conflict. That only occurs when each individual country is getting more and more scary, and so each country now has a rational incentive to try and band together to protect themselves and their own interests. The second big reason why conflict is less likely is that alliances make it more difficult to commit to conflict. If it is the case that you believe our characterization, which is that on our side you have comparatively more regional alliances and things like that, it means that everyone has to agree within a defense alliance whether to go to conflict or not. You can't just unilaterally make a decision. You have to ask all of your allies because they are also now committing resources and they also have skin in the game, which means that you need the approval of 7 countries rather than 1. And given that a bunch of countries have different conflicting interests, it means that you are less likely to actually push the red button and go to war. Before I go on, take question.
Yeah, how do you think China would react if Vietnam forms a military alliance with the US?
They'll be more scared. The third reason why you get less conflict is that you just get to police more, right? It's not the case that a lot of this just looks like countries going to war with each other. It just looks like countries being able to control their own borders, right? It looks like countries being able to fly, have more ships, protecting its protecting its own borders and things like that. Which and if you buy our characterization that it's smaller countries that are disproportionately increasing military capacity over bigger countries, I think that's really good because it means they are less likely to be preyed upon by larger countries. It literally just looks like things like countries having more military capacity to protect their fishing boats or protect shipping lanes and things like that, not only from other countries, but also from criminals and pirates and things like that, which I think all comes under the banner of regional peace and regional security, which means that now smaller countries actually have an additional capacity to protect their own interests. We think this is every day, maybe it's smaller scale, but it certainly occurs more often and it's far more likely than big scale conflict, which means that I think that you should weigh this very highly in debate. Second point is substandard. Why this means that countries form more alliances, why this is a unique tipping point to countries being close together. Firstly, they now don't want to go to conflict with each other insofar as they are in a military treaty together. Secondly, they now all have incentives to make sure that each other is doing really well. If you have a bunch of countries that are allied with you in a defense treaty and you're not sure if they're going to come to your defense or have the capacity to come to your defense because they're not economically doing very well, it means that you have more incentive to be friendly to them economically. It means that you have more incentive to not fuck over them in trade deals and things like that, because that hurts you. Thirdly, because as security becomes more urgent, diplomacy becomes more urgent. For example, now within ASEAN, because they want to present a unified front against China, Cambodia and Laos, which have historically been quite pro-China, and countries and other countries that are anti-China, need to come to the negotiating table and actually present a unified front and hash out those differences. Or it looks like the fact that Japan and India don't really have many other incentives to be really, really strong buddies, but they have a defense treaty, which means they are more likely to do diplomacy and negotiate with each other in other instances. And fourthly, it's because defense treaties present a far more ideological link versus other things like economics. Dhruv will expand on this. I'm very practical.
I think that's really good for that part of the speech. Now I'd like to move my major proposition.
Three things in this speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, why there's greater risk of escalation. And thirdly, why this results in worse regional peace. Firstly, on setup. The first thing I want to note in setup is that opening government has outlined an existential threat to the region, which is China, right? But my question is why China has precise interest in all of the Australasia region. Yes, China cares about Taiwan. Yes, China cares about the South China Sea specifically. But I think there's a high burden on government teams in general in this debate to explain why their influence is so severe that it must extend to the rest of the Australasia region rather than just increasing defense alliances across Southeast Asian nations generally, and why we need Fiji, why we need, Samoa, why we need New Zealand to increase their military significantly. I think that's a huge burden on government teams to explain why that military securitization that already exists in Asia at the moment, there's already, a lot of military alliances between Southeast Asian nations, for example, there's already economic alliances like ASEAN, to expand that influence into the Oceania region in general, and I guess Australia as well. Next thing, let's talk about why this is greater risk of escalation. We think that there are many actors in these regions that have incentives to create border skirmishes or in general provoke conflict with other people. Why is this? Firstly, there are many strongman actors in the region that have an incentive to push their power and to, that's part of their platform, to appear strong, to appear like they're doing border skirmishes. Look at, for example, border skirmishes on the China-India border. Secondly, powers want to project power. So even if the United States isn't a particularly strong main figure, they really want to project that they should be the global hegemon, that they should be the one in charge of world affairs, and so they project power by putting more ships, for example, into like Vietnamese waters. But thirdly, there is a duty now to protect your allies, which means that smaller regional conflicts blow up to be far, far bigger conflicts because far more people get involved. Just look at the hot wars that occurred in Vietnam, for example, that occurred in Afghanistan where the United States and Russia got involved, and you'll see that that was far, far worse for those wars in general. And I think these are likely to increase the escalation, and I feel like this is most valuably explained through examples of the past, which is that the United States put more ships in Vietnamese waters when they were worried about the communist infiltration of Vietnam, for example. And when the communist forces of Vietnam start to push up against the US borders, that's the perfect explanation for governments that are inclined to want to, project their military power, to have the explanation to say they're the one who fucked us over first and increase that escalation into that region. I think increasing military presence only increases reasons you can give people as to why they should go to conflict in the first place. We think that even then though, lower level conflicts in general are far more likely to have a violent response, and that's because there are far more people involved. The next thing I want to say here is that these reasons that we give you about strongman policies, about projecting power, are far more proximate to people who actually care about projecting their image, about those things. So I think that's far more likely that they go to conflict then when there's no ability to do it, or it's like irrational actors in the region that want to enact policies that allow them to stay in power for longer by being like we're in a state of war. The next thing to say is that escalation obviously happens in response to each other. So this is going to scale quite fast and quite rapidly. That expands the harms of the stuff we already talked about. Because when the United States builds a base, then China builds another base, and then the United States builds, you get what I'm talking about. But the next thing I want to say though is that that is all fine and good until one side wins or until one side pulls out, and I think that's when you get the crippling of the regions, of that region as a whole. Why do we think that's likely? Firstly, the United States is trending far more isolationist. If you look at the rhetoric of Trump or the rhetoric of the Republican Party in general, they say things like, why does the United States have to defend other people? We spend a shit ton of money on them and they give us very little in return. And I think that means that they're far less likely to do that in the future. But even if, eventually one side probably has to win, right? Look at the Cold War. Eventually one side economically collapsed because of that economic separation. And that leads to harmful regional effects of the countries who get dropped. For example, the reduction of aid to Latin American countries after the Cold War, the reduction of aid to African countries after the Cold War, they cripple their economies in general because they were particularly reliant on that aid, because they have to try to balance each side, and each side is giving them a lot more aid than they would in an instance where they don't have to securitize. We think that it would be better for them to just do their own development path than asking for aid from the United States and China. The last thing I want to say here is some impacting, which is just that obviously conflict is bad if we get conflict, but I also think it's bad that people divert their money into spending into military spending instead of spending on the economy, because economic links are what tie you together, are what stops you from going to war, because it becomes far more costly because you ensure one down economic turn because you lose all of that trade because you've sanctioned that nation, or you can no longer trade with them because the ships are blocked, and that is what leads to more economic collapse, which is what's harmful for the region as a whole. Before I move on, closing, you got anything?
States in this region aren't only a threat to each other. How do you think this changes Russia's calculus with respect to Central Asia or other states that are outside of the region we're talking about?
So I think, one, Russia's probably busy doing stuff in Ukraine, right? But secondly, all of those extreme, global powers already have incentives to expand their power. I don't understand why we should link smaller countries to them. Next then, let's talk about why this gets worse regional peace. The first thing I want to explain in this argument is that regional peace is just not just country versus country, but is the stability of individual countries themselves. Why is that? That is because when other individual countries become less stable, there are far more spillover effects, like refugees form into those areas. There's more lawlessness, so there's more militias that spread into other areas, for example. And that is likely because these places are clustered in economic groups, but other people also feel like they have duties, like New Zealand has duties to Pacific countries because we colonized them on behalf of Britain, or China has duties to Cambodia, for example. Why is this internal stability likely to become less stable? And that is just because we've increased the power of the military. We give them more money, we give them more prestige, we give them a lot of self-power to say they're particularly important and they're what's defending our country as a whole. And I think you can see that this leads to more military incursions on governments as a whole that makes those individual countries more less stable. Fiji has been military couped by Frank Bainimarama 3 times, and that's incredibly unstable for the region as a whole because economic trade is cut. They cut regional stability when there's more small conflicts there, or the spillovers like refugees and militias that harm the internal stability of other nations or other militaries feel empowered to do more coups. Look at the coup that happened in Thailand that encourages coups in Myanmar, for example. The last thing to say here is that this creates a particularly bipolar world because there is a reliance on foreign military aid of larger powers because you're balancing the United States and China off against each other. And in order to secure that aid, you often have to become entwined with one country, which opening government concedes. But those countries have their own agendas. They do not care about you, do not care about your internal politics, don't care about your country at all unless it suits their aims. And I think that's particularly harmful because you're reliant on a country that isn't willing to help you when China's not a threat or when the United States isn't a threat. They're only willing to help you as long as it serves them, and that's regional instability in the long run.
I'm going to start off with the incentive of these leaders. And that's because most of the mecs given by OO are entirely symmetric, yeah? Like, if strongman leaders exist on their side, they exist in both worlds. There's no reason why if you give somebody a couple of extra guns, that means they're more likely to engage, because presumably the incentives of internal bias within your population are exactly the same. So the question, so really, I think OO can claim the benefit, like, kind of given by the motion, which is, yeah, these guys have greater capacity because they have more guns. But certainly on incentives, there is no difference. What do they suggest though that isn't symmetric? The first claim is that hot wars are more likely because you have more intertwining of these nations. Firstly, that is actually a mechanism given by Aidan for the reason that you do not want to engage in these proxy wars to begin with. And they give the examples of Vietnam, which was certainly true in the past, but then fucked the US over well into the future, yeah? Which is why, for example, the US is so avoidant in trying to cause these proxy wars when they engage in sort of, for example, funding the Philippines currently with their military spending. It's because they've learned from these mistakes overwhelmingly, they know the harms that exist, and they do not want to engage. For my second observation on this is it's not clear why these guys ever have the incentive to start these proxy wars in the first place, right? Like I said, the problem with proxy wars is they also come with a bunch of external benefits, because at this point now, like for example, China and the US are so economically intertwined that you don't just have to have a proxy war in like the Philippines. Instead, you can then engage with a trade war that does actually bring harm to both nations, so that it's not just proxy wars are like the big nation is completely detached. As economies have become more intertwined, these nations now have other ways to hurt each other, and there's no reason why is they want to engage with proxy wars when if they wanted to engage with aggression, they can do alternate ways. But if they do engage with proxy wars, then these alternate mechanisms do come eventually and then hurt these guys anyway. So that's just an explanation as to why proxies probably aren't likely to happen here. The second claim is just like, well, more people are involved, and that means you're more likely to get more conflict. Like, no. Firstly, you give more funding to these people so they're just more educated in things like conflict resolution, which sounds like a police mechanism. Like, I'll give you guys that. But this does just actually occur overwhelmingly in places like on the border of India and China, where instead of seeing signs or like, not understanding the language of the person on your border, and then you pick up sticks and start beating each other, instead your incentive is just, hold on guys, let's not try and make a war out of this, and let's slow down and not engage with that. And that's why actually more people is better, because the more people that are available, the more likely you are to de-escalate that conflict, because there are more like rational minds engaged. So to believe their claim, you have to believe that all these soldiers really, really want a conflict, but there's no reason why is it that like India and China overwhelmingly want to fight each other, so their probably main directive is like, let's not start a conflict, so a bunch of people are probably able to engage with that. So this basically explains that on incentive is probably exactly the same set of like strongman individuals who probably do have like the same incentive in order to engage. On capacity, but that doesn't respond to the wealth of mechanisms given by Aidan. The fact that when you have more integration with other nations, it's far harder for you to engage in sort of large-scale conflicts. The fact that there's just far less incentive for you to engage in conflicts to begin with if you are economically intertwined with these nations. The fact that just when you have better technologies, it leads to less deaths because of the fact that rather than like, sinking a Vietnamese ship, that being interpreted, like for example, if you have like a Vietnamese ship that is like much more like weaker, for example, or not a destroyer, then it's far more likely you interpret things like, for example, that ship sinking or sailors drowning that, which may have been accidental, as active aggression from the other side. But when everyone has a similar level of technology, everything is just more secure. No one wants to engage with the other people, and the risk in which like external influences that might might be more uncertain, then cause misinterpretations that result in conflicts is just far less. And this is the far better mechanism as to why conflicts are less likely to happen, because the world overwhelmingly does not want to engage in these conflicts, because it's just better benefits to have economically. The last thing I want to suggest though is that when you encourage secondly then on economics, and this is an extension to explain why is it that you're more likely to become economically intertwined, and that necessarily means you're more likely to be protected. 3 reasons why this is important. Firstly, your incentive is far less when your economics are deeply intertwined. Why would you attempt to engage? And like my source for this is literally Bella in the Bong Bong debate, where she was like, China and the Philippines are so linked together. Secondly, there's less opportunity, and that is that people in your country in power can claim and say they have a better economic situation. So there's no need for you to stoke up sort of populism claims that you might have to in order for strongmen to succeed. So that is, they can instead fight on the fact that, you know, I have better economic resources because I've engaged with these alternate nations, and that's a far better mechanism in which they can compete and therefore not have to engage in the sorts of things that opposition suggests. But lastly, you're more likely to have things like lobbying from corporations, because when you have, for example, Huawei build up shops in Southeast Asian nations, that they are likely to lobby the government or tell the government, hey, let's not engage in a conflict because that's probably going to be bad for our stock price or bad for the people that we have in these nations. And because of the fact you just have, for example, increased populations of Chinese people in other nations, that means you're less likely to engage in those conflicts. Why is it that you get more economic bonds? The first thing I want to point out here is this debate is about this policy specifically. There's not like a counter fiat in this, so opposition can't just say we would do more economics. This is just an evaluation of the policy presented in the motion. So there is no counter fiat. Before that, yeah.
Yeah, why, without securitization, why do the localized wars that you describe occur in the Indo-Pacific?
Because like you can still have the capacity to fight without this thing implementing. Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about then why is it that you get more economics. The first thing I want to point out is that you do just trade military resources that do just increase the bond between your nations. These are highly skilled industries that are like highly skilled manufacturing industries that are just beneficial to both nations, which is why like China does a bunch of integrated circuit trading with a bunch of nations. That is actually just beneficial and improves the economies of both people quite significantly. Secondly, there's no incentive for you to form these initial connections. We bring the example of the fact that India had no incentive to form a connection with Japan economically, but they first formed a military alliance and then economically began trading because it took them to the table. Yeah, what do they say on economies? They claim that other countries might eventually drop you and that's bad. Firstly, our way of mechanisms explain why the intertwining is important, not just better economies on net, and that intertwining is a far greater incentive as why you don't oppose. But secondly, they don't explain why you get that funding anyway. Like presumably you would be worse off if the US never invested into your nation and then a bunch of people are in poverty. It's unclear why the drop itself is what is more likely to cause it rather than low-level underlying poverty. The last time in this internal stability, I just think is less important. Firstly, because most issues are pretty isolated when you have internal stability and do not cause large-scale crises that might result in this because people tend to want to stay out of a range of issues. But secondly, that is contingent on proving that nations are necessarily at risk of these things developing, as in that at risk of these military coups actually occurring and then taking over, as opposed to the US comes in, doesn't want their weapons to get put in the hands of military officers, and therefore is more likely to make the government less corrupt and less opposed. Because of the fact that globalization is actually pretty good, and the fact there is just no incentive, I'm so proud to propose.
For me. Firstly, on conflict. Secondly, about external threats to the region. And then thirdly, about destabilizing country. Firstly, on conflict. The opening government case is essentially mutually assured destruction. Our case deals with this in 2 ways. Firstly, we prove to you that ultimately this relies on a careful power balance that is precarious. Why is that? It's because of what Aisha says when she says there's a risk that one of those parties pulls out. When the US builds a base, China is forced to respond, otherwise they are showing weakness. That means that this motion causes incredible amounts of military presence to happen quite rapidly. But the US is an actor that is uniquely likely to pull out in the region, and they are that actor that is backing most of the countries we're talking about, like the OG concedes, right? Because it's in their own interest to stand up to China, and because they uniquely have the capacity as the largest military in the world. But they are likely to pull out, right? Why is that? Firstly, it's because of the fact that they reactionary policies are incredibly useful in getting over your competing politician or the other party. But secondly, just electoral flip-flopping is a natural trend, and I think this is incredibly likely to happen in the near-term future with the potential re-election of Trump or another Republican leader. But in comparison, other countries are just not going to demilitarize, right? China is never going to do this. Why not? Because they're not affected by electoral change, which is one of the mechanisms opening government relies on, but it's always going to be asymmetric. They aren't affected by voter pressure. They have their own unique policy agenda, and they are far more proximate to what happens in Asia. So they will always be invested in defending the South China Sea, versus America's interest can change on a whim. That means that what opening government does is they create a matchbox and they just wait for nothing to happen. Ultimately, we think that is incredibly bad. The second reason the case deals with this though, is we think that there are lots of irrational actors who are not disincentivized by this policy. And the only response we hear is that this is symmetric. But that is not true, right? What we tell you is that opening government just cannot prove an absolute absence of irrational actors. So there's always going to be one sort of actor that crosses that line and shoots the gun. But why do we think that this uniquely makes escalation more likely? Firstly, flipping their point about treaties, because now countries are uniquely obligated to get convened when that happens. When you do not have a treaty, you can exercise discretion. But when you have treaties, we think people are far more likely to have to get involved. This clashes with the characterization of treaties, right? They say that you are literally bound to only do what the US says. But if that was the case, nobody would ever enter into a military aid treaty, right? Like, obviously, it would not be beneficial for a smaller country to sign away their ability to defend themselves and defend their sovereignty whenever the US said so on a whim. We think it is far more logical that most military alliances look like NATO. They say that if you are attacked, we are literally obligated to come and get involved. The removal of discretion makes escalation far more likely. But secondly, and most obviously, it is just bad if there are more guns in the region. That is not something that we support. But I'll deal with the new material that we hear at DPN. The first thing we hear is that people are going to be educated in conflict resolution when we militarize. Be fucking for real. Internal military culture just does not align with this, right? There's obviously going to be an incredible lack of transparency from the government, and there's a tendency to defer to the military when you think that they are literally your only way to defend yourselves from an existential threat, right? But additionally, militaries traditionally have a culture of masculinity and aggression and toxicity. That means they're just never going to think that this is useful. But additionally, the interests of other actors are also not seeking to just de-escalate conflict, right? For leaders of countries, even liberal democracies, it looks good if your military is actually able to protect you and is strong, right? Those things actually resonate in the minds of voters. But for the interest of the party that is giving you the aid, like the US, they also want you to militarize because of the military industrial complex that profits when they set up another military base in the Pacific. Obviously, this means that it's not possible. The final thing we hear is that this debate, it's about economic intertwining. Firstly, you cannot use Baylis' analysis from the other debate. She's on our bench in this debate. And this is just not true, because you are far more likely to economically de-intertwine from the other side of the conflict when you have to get aid from the US, because the US has their own interests, which is to secure their own, trading partners in the face of Chinese growing economy. So obviously that means you're going to de-intertwine, that this just flips against you. Okay, yes, okay.
You say the US is going to blink first. The US military policy, which is overwhelmingly determined by the military bureaucracy, is one of the few aspects of US policy that's actually stable and doesn't tend to fluctuate massively between elections.
I just think that the whole idea that the military is stable is not true when you look at the fact that a president can come in and immediately pull out of Afghanistan, right? Like, obviously, I think this doesn't hold true. People have been running all these ideas, and that happens all the time. That's why they flip-flop all the time. Okay, secondly, talking about external threats of the region, obviously this is just not significant in the debate. Firstly, because these threats are not proximate. Note, if Russia tried to invade, they would not have legitimate claims, they would absolutely be demolished in international forums, but secondly, they lack the capacity to do so because they're not nearby, so obviously that is not a real threat. But secondly, it is actually bad if those parties have allies within a region like China that have increasing military power. You should not let that happen. Obviously, that would not be a valid extension. Finally, destabilizing countries. I firstly want to address what we hear from the other team, which is that it's really good to have economic aid. Two responses here. Firstly, in the the absence of increasing militarization, there would still be incentives for the US to give aid to developing countries. And that's because they are fighting a trade war with China. They want to secure their economy, they want to secure trading powers, they want to export soft power. It's unclear why they would rely on having military things to do that. But secondly, this form of economic stability is far less proximate to the things that we give you at opening opposition, which is that you are literally creating a risk that the military coups your leader and does far more crazy shit on the stage. So, what was it they told you? We told you that there were two reasons this destabilised countries. Firstly, because you empowered the military, you empowered them financially, and you also gave them additional prestige when you made it a national strategic priority to militarize your country. That is the kind of condition that allows the Fijian military to coup the government over and over again and just have incredible instability that forces countries around them to get involved because of their own obligations, because of their own economic concerns, like New Zealand having to go in and sort that out. But secondly, you invite foreign actors into that country because they want to reduce their power, but then they want to also control your institutions, and they pull out that aid in a way that actually destabilizes your country and leaves you far more open to the risk of destabilization. Let's weigh this. At our worst, even if you don't believe any of the conflict stuff, which I think is pretty persuasive, we proved a set of harms that is outside of the military hotspots that a lot of other teams in this debate will talk about. And that is significant, because we show a significant tangible benefit, or we prevent a significant tangible risk to those countries. And we also think that this is far more proximate to the idea of regional stability that we hear from opening government. Ultimately, very, very proud to oppose.
Two contributions from closing government. First, we'll explain and flip opening opposition, explain why this actually makes things like domestic military coups and military instability far less likely when the state is securitizing. And secondly, we will explain why this allows for the development of far better decision-making structures, allows for militaries to make better decisions, and allows us to have fewer mistakes that can blow up into conflict. Let's start with internal militarization. I want to start by acknowledging opening opposition's mechanism here, which is they say we will give more guns to the military, and therefore they will have more capacity to take over. The problem with this is that the military has a near monopoly on force within these countries, right? Like, there is no set of people with guns against whom they have a sufficiently larger advantage. That means that they're over it, right? So if they have by far the vast majority of guns in the country, it doesn't matter whether they have 400 times as many guns or 500 times as many guns as the next best, they are still able to do so. So it's never an issue of capacity, whether or not a military does a coup. They are the ones who enforce the government's power. Without them, the government would be taken by them. There is nothing to force against them. Yeah?
What about the fact that we tell you that when you make military a strategic priority, you actually give them more prestige power?
First, the militaries in this instance are enormously prestigious. Secondly, the thing about prestige would indicate that, I think the claim you're attempting to get at here is they require prestige in order to take it. They actually don't. If, for instance, if you walked into this room and you were like, I'm going to shoot you unless you do this thing, and I was like, well, fuck you don't have prestige, why would I listen to you? Right? Exactly. So clearly prestige is not the limiting factor. So why is it that actually you're more likely to get internal military coups? That is for three reasons. First, and most significantly, they're getting funded, they're getting money, and that is often the most substantial interest for militaries for a couple of reasons. First, because the troops within it want to get paid well, and that means that if they are getting taken care of by the state, it's a lot harder for their generals to get them on board with the idea that they should attempt to take over. But secondly, for the reason that militaries in this region, as is identified by opening opposition, often have some degree of independence from the central government, and that in order to have independence, they necessarily have to be often financially independent, otherwise how can you have that independence if you're reliant on government funding? And that means that when they're getting properly funded, they have less of an incentive to take over in order to help their other economic interests. So the fact that we fund them better means they're far less likely to try this. Secondly, they no longer, so often militaries, by nature of the set of people who choose to join the military, care a lot about national defence. They often believe there are large national defence threats in the region, and they're far more likely to coup at the point where they believe that security is not being taken seriously enough by the central government. So, when it is being taken seriously enough, when they're investing in securitisation, you are less likely to coup because you think they're doing a bad idea. Now, the response from opposition bench to this argument could be, well, no, actually, we're correct, and it would actually make the world less safe when we have securitisation. Leaving aside the fact that that is not true for the set of reasons the opening government points out, even if you believe that, the military clearly believes, by the nature of who they are, that military strength is the best way to enforce peace. So you're not going to be able to convince them that not investing in the military is the way to create peace. What are the impacts of them being more likely to coup? First, as opening opposition identifies, this is an enormous harm to the internal peace. A military coup is often violent, it is terrible for the country, it comes with a high degree of disarray. But secondly, this is also the most substantial question on the question of the most substantial mechanism on the question of external security as well. And that is for the reason that when you have a military government take over, they are more likely to do military things. It's a set of people who have been conditioned to believe that the military is the correct answer to problems, the most powerful mechanism to solve those problems. So they're far more likely to be externally aggressive as well. How does this weigh in the debate? The weighing against opening opposition is very, very simple. This is by far their best argument. We flip it, we beat them. But the weighing against opening government here is that, first of all, insofar as we're able to defeat opening opposition's claim on the internal level of peace, we're able to do a far greater job of opening government than winning the opening half. Because maybe you believe that on weighing opening government's external peace things way over their internal peace things, at the conclusion of us, we have a degree of certainty that the government bench wins this debate because we're able to win on both metrics. And secondly, as I just explained, this internal, who has internal control of the country being the military, is the most persuasive explanation of why you're likely to get their metric of external harm as well. Second extension, why you're likely to get more and better decision making. So, why are you likely to get more robust military decision making when you have this form of securitization? Well, you clearly have an incentive to invest into strong decision making processes for your military. First, for the reason that you just have an incentive to stop bad decisions being made because they can lead to unnecessary conflict. But secondly, even if you think they do lead to unnecessary conflict, having strong decision-making processes is also good for other things, even if you don't care about the external risk to bad decisions igniting conflict. If you just believe that better decision-making mechanisms are better for the internal functioning of your military, you're likely to invest in them. Why do we get better military decision-making on our side, better decision-making structures? And just to concretize what this looks like, it generally looks like far more robust reporting structures. It looks like far more robust processes for how decisions are made and who is able to make them, requiring multiple sign-offs from multiple people and various bureaucratic processes for the making of decisions. Why do we get that more on our side? Two reasons. First, we fund the military more. Things like developing robust decision-making processes require money, both because you have to design them, and secondly, because you have to employ a larger set of people who are then involved in that bureaucratic decision-making. But secondly, when you care about the military more, there's more political incentive to do things like strong reforms to the way that the military and its senior command operates. And they're also likely to do this in a way that is highly integrated. That's to say that they're more likely to give themselves the ability to not only make stronger decisions themselves, but also to make stronger decisions with respect to their allies, because they're aware of the danger of things happening, and that means that they are able to, that means that they have a clear incentive to not only design strong decision-making processes, that they have some bureaucratic process for them making decisions, but some kind of forums for discussion between those sets of people. What are the benefits of stronger decision-making processes? First, they're less likely to make a mistake, so we're less likely to get that blowing up into conflict. Secondly, when you provide them with more information, like a lot of this looks like, for instance, intelligence gathering, so that those decision-making processes have more information to make decisions with, there's less uncertainty. And when there's less uncertainty, you often act in a risk-averse way, which is to go out and begin doing things that are particularly dangerous. When you don't have information, when there's uncertainty, that's when people freak out. That's when they start conflict preemptively. And even small conflicts blow up. First, because when there's small conflict, there's public outrage against the fact you're attacked. Secondly, you often have to respond, otherwise you give implicit assent to the fact that you were attacked. And third, you often misinterpret even a small decision-making failure to accidentally attack one of your ships as the start of war, right? And the thing I've noted on weighing here is that it's in no one's interest to start a war. It's clearly most likely that a war starts by an accident. When we establish why we get stronger decision-making processes, we reduce the likelihood of those accidents, so we reduce the likelihood of conflict.
I'm going to start by doing some maths.
10 vessels in the South China Sea. On the side of opposition, you have 2. And 10 is larger than 2. And our extension, yes, and our extension is that this increases accident between blocks. Because it's not about Vietnam versus Filipino ships, it's about the US interpreting China's escalation in a way that is bad. It means that they respond in turn, it means that they respond with fire, and that is ultimately the thing that causes the most amount of escalation, the most amount of damage, and the most amount of accident. So, what is our extension? Our extension is that this causes spillover effects that do a huge amount of impact on the ground. How do we build an OO? Because I want to be really clear that this is not a derivative extension, and I trust the panel to track, but I'm going to point out where we differ from them. Because what OO says is 2 things. Firstly, these countries like China want to be strong men, and second of all, they're inherently intertwined. There are 3 things they don't explain. Firstly, they don't explain why escalation is more likely than deterrence and de-escalation. Beyond, you can't show weaknesses and alliances mean you have to get involved. 2, they don't explain why escalation results in conflict, which is ultimately the end game in the round, because it's not one side wins as they say, it's actually just war. But thirdly, we break the symmetry problem that opening government themselves actually point out. So, let's explain, why do we cause spillover effects? The first thing I want to explain in this extension is why China is likely to view this as a threat. 3 reasons, none of which opening opposition touch. Firstly, they have direct interest in the Australasian region. That looks like 1, a huge amount of supply links that exist, but 2, it looks like the South China Sea and their huge levels of nationalism that mean they're likely to opt in a way that's bad. Second of all, they're worried about the containment effect. And what I mean by this is they are worried about the fear of getting strangled by the US if other countries more tightly align with them. Thirdly though, China is worried that they're ultimately going to have to stand alone. They are worried that countries are going to pick sides that are not them. Second of all, how does China respond? 2 ways. Firstly, they compete on securitization. And what does this actually look like? Because we know the fact that opening opposition never properly explains this. What it means is they, 1, increase the amount of ships that they themselves control, but 2, they increase the amount of ships that they give to other countries that are their allies because they don't want countries to get them from the US instead. Guaranteed opposition's response is going to be like, well, yes, that's the motion, there's more ships. I'm going to explain to you the huge amount of harms that are going to exist at the point where there are more ships, for example, in the South China Sea, the accidents and spillover effects that occur. Second of all, though, it just leads to a huge increase in provocations. So, note, for example, the increase in, when the Philippines tried to get resupply ships in the South China Sea, lasers were used, noise pollution was used, a huge amount of sailors died. But we know the fact that, for example, when South Korea tried to buy anti-air defenses or bought anti-air defenses from the US, the response from China was tariffs and decreasing in investment. This is the proof that when China feels threatened by other countries aligning elsewhere, they respond with economic sanctions and with political ones. Next, why do we think China is willing to do this? Because no Dhruv is like, well, the China and Philippines are dependent on each other because I pointed that out in the other round. Wrong debate, buddy. 3 new extensions, 3 new reasons. First of all, likely civilians in China will just demand this. Know the fact that citizens in China are incredibly aggrieved and angered by militarization, which means they want a public and visible response. For example, note the fact that when Pelosi visited Taiwan, think about China's response to that, right? The US interprets this as a full-scale increase and likely to respond in turn in a way that is incredibly disproportionate. The second reason why China is willing to do this is this is something the elites want. Think about high-level military officials. Think about their incentives. They have a direct incentive to do this and be compliant with it. Thirdly, though, they just need some form of symbolic deterrence, the same way they did with South Korea when they purchased anti-air vessels from them. What are the impacts of this? I think threefold. First of all, it just increases the risk of accident in the sea, for example, because it's not about more guns, as opening opposition says. It's about more large-scale military weapons that have a huge scale of risk, right? So it's like those boats clashing into each other in the sea just causes so much death on the ground, and I don't think opening opposition ever contends with that. Second of all, though, you lead to a higher risk of misinterpretation of these instances. We know that the US is incredibly retaliatory, and even if China is not actually going to escalate, the fear of them escalating is what unlocks all of the harms that opening opposition talks about. Because note that their case is contingent on things actually happening, our case is contingent on believing those things may happen, and that is what unlocks the response from the US that is bad. But third, the impact of it is that you lose military communication access that is just vital, because now it's far less palatable to have military-to-military personnel communication, and that means you lose out on things like, 1, a massive safeguard of if accidents happen, having other people there to help you, but also you just lose that cultural understanding that is really important. What is the weighing of this contribution in the round? Firstly, we just give far better reasons as to why escalation is likely, but more importantly, we actually impact what that escalation does. We explain why escalation is going to cause explicit impacts, particularly in the South China Sea, thinking about things like lazy interpretation, thinking about things like ship bombarding. Second of all, let's explain responsive to closing opposition, but first I'll take opening.
I already explained that because the stakes are higher, we make it more urgent for countries to, one, make it clear what is acceptable and what is not, and two, clarify potential accidents through diplomacy.
No, absolutely not. You don't do diplomacy, you do militarization. They are literally antithetical to each other. The way that other countries interpret buying more ships and buying more guns is not by being diplomatic, it's responding in turn. Whenever has the US seen China increasing its level of militarization and been like, let's do diplomacy instead? Obviously not. Second of all, let's explain why domestic coups are less likely as opposed to what Matt tells us, which is that they are more likely. 3 reasons. 1, escalation is used opportunistically by domestic actors within countries to increase political tensions. And the thing that we would note here is that, for example, in the Solomon Islands, the way that leaders have used militarization is to suppress rivals and is to secure power in a way that is incredibly pernicious. Second of all, though, it means that when leaders are losing ground, they turn to militarization as a lifeline. So when they need support, they can easily weaponize militarization and escalation in a way that is really bad for constituents on the ground. But thirdly, we know that actors are incredibly irrational with conflict. Escalation causes fear, and that is bad. Fourthly, though, you just get the increase of arms races within the region and arms races of regional blocs being pitted against each other, and that is obviously bad for international conflict. So, what is the contribution from closing opposition at the end of the round? Firstly, we have given you explicit reasons as to why China is likely to engage in escalation and the US is likely to respond in turn. And we've explained to you that even if they don't necessitate that escalation, it is the very fear of escalation that causes China to respond in a negative way. But second of all, we've been far more explicit with what the impacts of escalation actually look like, explaining that it is the accidents and spillovers that ultimately occur all of the impacts that opening opposition wants to claim in the round, and that is why we win.
Three things: weighing the extension, responding to closing opposition, and then opening opposition. Firstly, in terms of the extensions, the problem with most other teams in this debate besides closing opposition is that the capacity for conflict, or discussions about how likely defense attacks are, what decision-making calculuses look like, or whether or not countries are able to negotiate, etc., are all basically irrelevant to this debate. Because obviously, it's in no country's rational interest to engage in a conflict, no matter how big or small that military is. For the reason that the main deterrence from conflict was never how likely you were to win the overall war. The main deterrence was always trade, irrelevant to the size of your military. The fact that if either country engaged in conflict, you lose all ties to the United States, or you lose all ties to China, you lose the capacity for regional trade, you get economic sanctions placed on you, you get the cost of war, you get the internal stability that's produced by conflict, which suggests to you that clearly conflict is super unlikely on both sides, and when it happens, it will always be bad. The most important contribution then was never going to be about adjusting people's rational decision-making calculus around whether war was going to happen, because military was the deciding factor on that rational calculus. The most important contribution was always going to be about eliminating the set of irrational decision calculi that might actually, in a reasonable case, lead to conflict, lead to war. And on this, closing government clearly wins the debate, because we proved to you 2 things. Firstly, we explained to you that in an instance in which you have the fear of a large actor like China, and you have a military that wishes to defend the sovereignty of your country, that when you deny them funding, when you deny them the capacity to act and do that protection in reasonable ways, that's when you get a military that is more rogue, that's when you get a military that seeks more independence, that's when you get a military that does things like coups. That was created both internal instability and conflict, which is a component of regional peace, but it's also what creates militaries whose command structures are distinct from the reasonable and rational decision-making calculi of governments who care more about things like trade. And secondly, we explained that when you build integration between governments and military, and you build up the capacity of not just the boats that those militaries have, but also their decision-making capacity and their command structures, that's when you get transparency and effectiveness in military decisions, which makes the decisions more rational. So you shouldn't be persuaded by either opening opposition or opening government, because neither of them is able to substantively prove to you that war gets more or less likely. Why do we beat opening government? 2 reasons. Firstly, the vast majority of their contribution around military deterrence is exceedingly marginal, because this is a very small addition to an already very large deterrent that exists in the status quo. So perhaps you're persuaded that it's true, but it shouldn't persuade you that it's that important. And secondly, they make some contribution on decision calculi by saying, well, we have better trained troops, but this is less effective than us for one main reason, which is just that higher command structure decisions are clearly more important. Individual troops, even when well trained, aren't often the ones making these decisions, and military command structures are upstream of those decisions. So implementing rules and codes, things like not having control over major weapons on ships in the first instance, is what actually meaningfully prevents those conflicts, or preventing that military from going rogue in the first place, which I think establishes us that we are progressing through this round after knocking out both those teams. Next, I'll respond to closing opposition. 3 claims to respond to. Firstly, they say, well, China militarizes more in response. The first problem with this is it's a bit like that meme where you have like a Sydney debater who provides 8 mechanisms for something that everyone already knew was true. Like when Auckland said China would retaliate, you should already have been persuaded of this. These extra mechanisms are not particularly useful to debate. But secondly, it's unclear to me that China perhaps has the incentive, but whether they have the capacity to do so. They are economically struggling due to consequences of the zero-COVID policy and things like property debt. And secondly, they already have an extremely substantial military, and additions to that military incur ongoing costs on top of the initial investment of building that boat. Like you have to man all of the troops and pay them a salary. You have to give them food. You have to create a port for that ship to stay at. All of which adds increasing ongoing costs, which for the 60 years for which that boat is in operation, increase the operational cost of the military as a whole, further locking China into an economic burden which it is already suffering as a consequence of. So I just don't see why it wouldn't use its existing large military, which in the status quo is already doing things like patrolling regions, is already doing things like aggression, is already doing things like expansionism, rather than increasing the number of boats that it has. Next they say, well, there's more likely to be accidents. But I'm just not sure how these accidents happen. Like, do you slip and fall on the steering wheel and then it turns? Like, this is a very large ocean, and the boats are very fast. A very large red button that clearly says this launches the missile. I don't think it's true that you can accidentally cause a conflict in this way. Most often where accidental conflicts occur is when you sort of misinterpret whether something is like a war vehicle or not a war vehicle, or whether a plane is a threat or not, whether it's going to bomb you or not. That is true like when you have like in other instances, but I just don't think it's particularly true of a naval conflict in this region. And maybe it's potentially true that if you have like 11 more boats instead of 10 more boats, and I'll remind you by the way, one single boat costs like $300 million, so we're not talking about like a 10-fold expansion of the military, this is a marginal expansion of the military, that accidents become meaningfully more likely. So even if accidents were possible, I don't think it's a very useful contribution. Third claim closing opposition makes is, well, dictators use escalation as a chance to expand control and create fear. The issue with this is, it presumes that the thing that's creating the fear is the expansionism, but clearly the inverse of that is true. Fear exists, and then people demand expansionism. Countries like China do things like expansion, taking over islands for their economic interests. In response to that, people fear their sovereignty will be taken over, and they demand escalation. In those instances in which you have a fear which is present, and you do not adequately respond to it by providing people with protection, that is where people turn away from their government and towards the military command, which is exceedingly likely to be calling for these things. Before I run out of time, I'll take opening.
Perhaps Bella wrote her extension after my speech, but doesn't engage with the depth of analysis you get at Grace. We also explain why escalation cannot be done and creates an asymmetry. Doesn't this defeat your point about military decision making, because it is strategic for some military to start conflict?
What militaries is it strategic to start conflict for? Like, is it strategic for Vietnam? Is it strategic for the Philippines? Is it strategic for Samoa? Is it strategic for China? I don't think that's true. The rest of what you said, I can't remember what the depth was at Grace. Sure, it was great. I'll respond to it maybe when I respond to opening opposition. All right, next let's talk about opening opposition. Firstly, they say there's more risk of escalation. Firstly, for the reasons I've already established, escalation is super unlikely. Huge other deterrents other than conflict. They don't provide any substantial reason why this is more likely. Secondly, a lot of these makes just explain why the escalation, if it happened, would be worse. But that's not explaining why the risk of it becomes greater. That's not a very important contribution for the reason that no matter what kind of conflict occurs, whether it's 10 boats or 11 boats involved in the conflict, or one country or two, probably involves a lot of deaths. Next, they say you'll economically disentangle yourself from other countries in the world if you're regionalizing. Firstly, the opposite of this is true. If people don't have more military protection, firstly, they elect leaders that are more isolationist and radicalist to get some form of a feeling of safety. And secondly, they turn more often to things like sanctions. Secondly, defense pacts often lead to things like trade pacts. And thirdly, if they do, it's not that bad. Both the US and China are pretty good trade partners. You reshuffle your economy, you'll probably be fine. Finally, they say you get more military instability. We flip this. Very proud to go.
when Aidan concedes that China will be scared, I think they immediately lost the debate. Because when a great power feels scared, the instinct is not to kowtow and to step back. It is to show strength for the absolute political necessity that Bella describes to you. I'm going to start with closing government, because their analysis of coups is just the wrong part of the world. Like, the one thing we know from the topic is it's Australasia, which is famed for having a whole bunch of developing nations that are relatively free of coups compared to any other part of the world. And the reason is because coups lack degrees of legitimacy. They only come from that type of environment. That there is significant amount of growth in these countries. These are countries that have had large amounts of stability and forms of democratic governments within those systems, which strongly suggests that these militaries do not have the ability to implement a coup that will actually be believed, and as such this securitization mechanism doesn't make a great deal of sense. But this is also Australasia, where the coup in the region is Myanmar, which was kind of not a riding success and might suggest that many other countries are deeply unlikely to follow suit, that militaries will seek to increase their internal influence rather than implement the disaster case that they describe. At the end of this, I have no idea what country in Australasia they think is going to experience a coup, maybe Thailand? I have really no idea, and no explanation therefore about why the specific military pensions are the key factor to stop this type of thing. We say that long term, giving more power, giving more funding, giving more influence to these military forms of influence to be able to bypass civilian governments increases their ability in the future to cause these coups. I think this extension is marginal at best, but more realistically probably not significant in this debate. Let's then deal with, I think, actually the most significant threat, which is a lot of the quibbles being like, you guys are derivative. Okay. Let me explain precisely what OA gives in the debate, and I'll step through what our contribution precisely is then. Because the mechanism that our opening provides in this debate is an explanation about why these countries both have strongman incentives, and incentives, for instance, for their militaries to be relatively masculine, and therefore respond in ways that are problematic. I think this argumentation has a few different problems that we uniquely fix under our side. And that is an explanation about why perceiving this escalation as a threat causes many of the problematic responses, not just from this type of idiosyncratic instances that they describe, but from all actors within this debate. So, when Bella describes how there is domestic unrest within these countries when they see these type of instances, that is why they get out there to pressure their governments, both in China, with a country that is deeply nationalistic, as I think their mechanization more describes, but also for the US. When they look at the types of assertive actions that China is doing, that is what makes the populace within the US feel like it is almost inevitable that a war will occur. And that domestic analysis that Bella gives, I think, is far more nuanced than that. But we give away more than that, right? We explain the analysis about why a lot of these countries have absolute elite capture with individuals that certainly are deeply nationalistic and that want to show strength. Explanations about why they need a symbolic show of strength. So in their rational interest, they're trying to appease their domestic audience, but that is perceived incorrectly by other parties within the world. Leading these types of responses explains why this cycle occurs, specifically resilient to many of the responses that Government Bench gives in this debate. Because Government Bench, I think, makes two observations. One, pointing out a lot of the symmetry of this analysis, where they're just like, these countries are strongmen, irrespective, they're going to do this regardless. Our explanation explains why it is not inevitable, why securitization is causing these strongman governments to have to react in a specific way. Because our analysis is not just these countries are nationalistic, it is their precise incentives and why their political survival means that they engage in a type of series of actions that they have to do. We say these governments and these political leaders often know it is against the interest of their country to engage in this military drill, to do this type of provocative action. They don't like that risk, they do it because they have to, and that mechanization certainly does not come from our opening. But second, and this is totally unique from our opening, is an actual explanation of how escalation leads to war. And you can call this an impacting extension, but I just think that at the end of the opening opposition, you have more ships and an arms race, and I'm like, ... why is this a bad thing in the debate? And so I actually think our key explanation is breaking the POI that we get of that Charlie Watts thing like, but there's a large amount of water between the boats. Bell's analysis is really cunning here to explain why these type of provocations actually now seriously increase the chance of accidents. But he gives examples of a laser beam that is shining at your naval ship. You might think it's actually pretty plausible that you interpret that as a genuine military threat against your vessel. His explanations about why the first thing that is cut is the guardrails that opening government wants to describe in this debate. When you have a country that literally is now using these guardrails as a bargaining chip for you actually listening to my concerns, where we refuse to communicate with your military when it is being so provocative to us, are we our mechanization on the political toxicity of military generals that look at this type of guardrail and say, what is that guardrail doing to us when you are escalating and continuing to build arms? With the military generals that overtly are unlikely to launch this type of policy in the first place, with the domestic populace that is totally unwilling for you to engage in this type of diplomatic activities because they think it shows signs of weakness. Our mechanization explicitly explains why these guardrails are the first thing that are sacrificed and why that causes accidents in this debate. And as such, I'll take opening.
We pointed out in the response that the most common and certain instance of security infringement is things like attacks on fishing and shipping boats that smaller countries previously couldn't protect and patrol. They now have the capacity to do so. That helps a lot of people.
Brother, like the Philippines is in alliance with the US, they're not going to call the US in to declare war on China for this type of illegal fishing. I think the real big problem with this analysis is twofold. Firstly, you don't actually overcome our actual analysis explaining why increased assertive activities by the Philippines to defend those type of vessels does not increase the threat perception that China feels, and it escalates in turn, causing many of the problems that you described economically. But perhaps more significantly, I think if you cared about the economics, which is the other thing our opening discusses in this debate, we're still sitting fine, because it shouldn't be surprising that conflict seriously harms any form of economic prosperity that any team can derive in this debate. When there were military drills around Taiwan, there was an enormous disruption in the rerouting of shipping vessels, a huge amount of uncertainty of the safety of those products that significantly increased the insurance costs of those goods. And this is a military drill, let alone a genuine accident or misunderstanding that would seriously impair the enormous amount of trade that goes to this region of the world. We both directly increase peace, but if you care about the economic side as well, it is the fear of accidents that impairs trade and prevents the type of good investments that the rest of this debate cares about. Finally then, why do we beat this opening government? They have two broad problems on the question of conflict. One is they say this deters localized opportunistic conflicts without proving what those localized wars are likely to look like. This is Australasia, where these type of localized conflicts are impossible to fight because there's an enormous amount of trade in the region pulling in all the actors surrounding you because they all have interest to prevent this war on both sides of the house. But last, it is because ultimately this war is not rational, and our explanations about why you lose many of these guardrails against the interests of these own countries therefore explains why a lot of the rational calculuses in this debate unfortunately do not significantly apply. At the end of this debate, China being scared is a really, really big harm.